Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and this is another edition of Fresh Red Kills. So Fresh Red Kills is where I talk about books that I've recently read or that I am currently reading. I have two books I'm going to be talking about today. One of them that I read for Nonfiction November, and one that I read in that first weekend in December, a very short book. In November, for Nonfiction November, because I am somebody who reads nonfiction a lot throughout the year anyway, I decided to read books that had been on my shelf for over a decade, that I finally just committed to getting to and finishing. So one of them that I read here is Brian Greene, The Elegant Universe, Superstrings, Hidden Dimensions, and the Quest for Ultimate Theory. This did end up winning, I believe, a Pulitzer, if I'm not mistaken. Sorry for the glare, got the sun starting to move here. And I was, of course, vaguely familiar with string theory, and I wanted to get to know, just to get to know it more, to learn more about it. So I thought, I have this on my shelf, I might as well read it. Fully aware that a lot of the promises that people had hoped string theory would give us, maybe another step towards M theory or the theory of everything, hasn't really come to fruition. That, you know, Greene in this talks about this was being written in the midst of the second renaissance of string theory, when there was all this excitement. I think that excitement has disappeared again. Maybe there'll be a third renaissance. But with that in mind, I figured this is probably still a good place to go to at least understand, if I can, what string theory is. However, I did go into this with an agreement to myself that I would not overthink it, that I would not get lost in the details, that I would not get bogged down. You know, I knew I wasn't going to be able to grasp everything. I don't have a physics background. The sciences that I took in school, both in high school and in college, were mostly biology. I did take some astronomy courses, but I never actually took a physics course. I think because it was too much like math that I avoided it. And that brings up, if you bear with me for a second, okay? You know, math was never my strong point going through school. I managed to take my senior year in high school with no math at all. I took social studies electives and humanities and writing courses. And then in college, I took the bare minimum. I tested out of the lowest level math, but otherwise, I think I had to take 2 more math courses for my bachelor's to fulfill the requirements, and I took the lowest ones that I could just to get it over with. I remember I signed up for one class. It was called Elementary Applied Mathematics, because that sounded really easy. But by day 2, I fully understood that, no, this is actually business pre-calculus, and I was not at all for that, so I dropped out of that. Now, I say that especially because I think about my wife. My wife is very mathematically minded. She teaches math on the high school and the college level. In fact, she teaches the course that I dropped out of. But math, you know, she can do math much better than I can. But she struggles, you know, with some things that come easy to me. One big example would be something like Shakespeare. She told me earlier this year that she didn't like Shakespeare, and that came as a total shock to me. I had no idea. I wondered what other dark secrets she was hiding from me. But she told me that she didn't like it because she didn't understand it. She had a hard time with it. You know, I realized I could read a lot of Shakespeare in middle school, so that stuff came easy to me. So I remember when I reread Macbeth over the summer, we watched the Roman Polanski version together. And part of watching that with her, wait for that car to go by, was to acclimate her a little bit more to Shakespeare. So we would watch it, and I would pause, and we would talk about the dialogue, and I would let her know what was going on. And ultimately, she could follow the overall plot, but she was missing a lot of details. And she would be surprised when I would explain to her what a line meant or what they were actually talking about. And sometimes it was very, very far afield from whatever she thought they were talking about. And that's kind of how her watching Shakespeare was kind of how I felt reading this. I follow the general plot, but I know I'm not grasping the details. The first third of this book, he talks about the theory of relativity, and I think that's those concepts are not easy, but they are easier to visualize and to conceptualize. And then he gets into quantum theory, and that's where I'm like, okay, I follow him sometimes, but it's definitely a little bit harder to follow. And then, of course, he gets into string theory, and at that point, I just have to take his word on just about everything. And you know, it gets a little bit almost too detailed at times, where it becomes difficult to actually follow the plot. So I am glad that I read this. It is filled with all kinds of visuals to help along, and these are needed. These are very badly needed when he's trying to explain things. And I will say Greene does a very good job of explaining things. It's just that, you know, there's only so much that he can explain without just giving you a math equation. So like I say, I kind of felt like my wife watching Shakespeare with this. I'm glad that I read it. I think I understand string theory a little bit more. You know, and where it falls in line, why the belief is that maybe it could potentially unite the theory of relativity with quantum theory. You know, and I think I'm getting that stuff. But when he's talking about curled dimensions and you know, what are some of the here are some of those curled up dimensions. You know, it's much harder to visualize exactly what he's talking about. But anyway, like I said, I'm glad I read it. I don't know how much more I'm going to go trying to read about string theory. All I wanted to do is get a better understanding, and that was accomplished. And like I said, I didn't allow myself to get bogged down in the details. I just kind of kept moving forward with it. And I'm kind of glad I did. It probably was a more enjoyable experience that way rather than a frustrating one. The other thing that I read, this tiny little book here, The Lessons of History by Will and Ariel Durant. This is my first thing I've read by this couple. I know that they had that multi-volume history of civilization. I do have a copy of their Story of Philosophy on my shelf that I haven't read yet. But this seemed interesting. It says, the celebrated collection of essays compiling over 5,000 years of history by two of the greatest thinkers of our time. That is quite a big statement. And really what this is, they are very short essays. I mean, they're more like chapters, but they're very short essays that just are on different topics like biology and history, morals and history, economics and history. I think if you're somebody who knows a decent amount about history, you're not going to be surprised by the things that are in here. I will say that as I read this, I did start to question the very idea that this book is posing, that we can have all these lessons from history, because it is so easy to cherry pick incidents to make them fit whatever lesson you want to give. You know, yes, there are situations in history where events are similar, but they're ultimately unique. So this was fine for a quick read. Now, what's odd about this is I did see that on Audible Plus, there is an audiobook of this, and it's so thin, I thought that was curious that there would be an audiobook. But it wasn't just this. The audiobook also had, at the end of each essay/chapter, excerpts from interviews that were done with Will and Ariel Durant. I think shortly after this was released. This is released in 1968. And in the interviews, they actually referenced the protests in Vietnam. So the interviews were done, I guess, late 1960s, I'm guessing. And in addition to those interview snippets, you also have two previous unpublished essays that were part of the audiobook. So I read along with the audiobook, and so I would read and then I would listen. And I will say that this book, Will and Ariel come out as, you know, quite even-keeled, pretty sober thinkers, you know, certainly not reactionary in any way, at least not that I thought. But listening to the audiobook, I did come up with a different experience between the interviews and also the added stuff, the previous unpublished stuff. Will Ariel does come off as much more reactionary, and especially when it comes to sexual morality. He did seem to have this fear. The first premise that I questioned, that doesn't get touched on much. It's like briefly mentioned, but it's not stressed. But it's much stressed much more in the audiobook, that Will believed that morality needed religion. That without religion, people would just, no morality could stick. You basically needed that fear of, I guess, damnation or a God handing down commandments in order for people to ultimately act moral, which I don't believe, and I'm kind of surprised that he believes it, because other things that he says, he wouldn't have reason to believe that. But he was not Christian himself. He had left Christianity. He talks about how his idea of God is much more pantheist, like Einstein, not necessarily a personal God that you pray to. So he didn't need religion for morality, but he seemed to think that everybody else did, and especially the poor. The sexual morality seems to come from the fact that he seemed to have, if I'm understanding correctly, this idea that civilization, including morals, was passed down, from generation to generation, parent to child. And if people didn't control their libido, you would have too many children out of wedlock, and then civilization and morals would not be passed down. And it seemed like it was a danger to civilization if people were too sexually adventurous. He actually comes off as very prudish. Like anything that is a deviation from, traditional bonds of marriage, intercourse, sex out of wedlock, or anything like that, certainly homosexuality as well, was a sign that civilization was in decline. And I certainly don't accept that. And in those situations between religion as a requirement for morality, and also he doesn't harp on it in the book, but in the audiobook, he keeps coming back to this idea of sexual morality and indiscretion. Will Ariel comes off as much more reactionary and prudish in a lot of ways. So I have to say, if I just read the book, I would give it fairly high marks. I really enjoyed it. The audiobook, I came away a little bit more about some of their thoughts. The less you elaborate on what they're talking about, I think the more effective it is. So, it sounds like the audiobook would be a terrific experience, and it's certainly eye-opening. If you really want to know more about Will and Ariel Durant, maybe the audiobook is the way to go, but ultimately I liked just the book better. Or at least I came away with a higher regard for some things they were saying from if I just based it on the book. So anyway, those are two things that I have recently read. You've got The Elegant Universe by Brian Greene, and Lessons of History by Will and Ariel Durant. And that's it. I am currently reading The Mysteries of Udolpho, and hope to finish that within the next 2 weeks. So anyway, thank you for watching, and as always, thank you, BookTube.